laughed first, then they pointed, and by the time the tallest of them held up a blackened loaf for the whole crowd to see, the widow behind the table had gone very still, the way a woman goes still, when she has already decided not to cry in front of people who want to watch her do it. Then a hand the size of a shovel blade closed around that same burnt loaf, set down a pinch of raw gold on the scale beside it, and bought every crumb on the table without saying a single word. That was the morning the town learned it did not know as much as it thought it did. The frost had come early that year, laying a hard silver skin over the ruts of the trading post yard, and the air carried the smell of wood smoke and horse, and the particular cold that gets into a person's knuckles and stays there until noon. She had been out since before light, her hands cracked and reddened, arranging the loaves in rows on the plank table the way she always did, largest to smallest, though it hardly mattered, since none of them were shaped the way bread was supposed to be shaped. They were dark on the outside, nearly black in places, humped and lopsided, the crust split like old leather left too long in the sun. The women gathered the way they always did, in twos and threes, drawn by nothing more than the shape of a Tuesday and the pleasure of having somewhere to stand together. The postmaster's wife arrived last and loudest, thin as a fence rail, her voice carrying the particular authority of a woman who believed cleanliness and correctness were the same thing. She picked up a loaf between two fingers, as though it might soil her glove, turned it over, and asked the gathering crowd whether the widow had baked bread or dropped a stove log in the fire by mistake. The widow did not answer. She had learned, in 2 winters of standing at that table, that answering only fed it. It was the boy behind the barrel who saw him first, the elder of her 2 sons, 9 years old, small enough to disappear against the post's timber wall, watching the way children watch when they sense something is about to happen that the adults haven't noticed yet. The stranger came up through the gathering slow, the way big men often move, careful not to knock into what they can't see past their own shoulders. He was taller than any man in that yard by a full head, his forearm marked with an old scar that ran pale and twisted from wrist to elbow, another cutting along his jaw like a line drawn with a knife and never quite erased. He did not look at the women, he looked at the bread. He picked up the loaf the postmaster's wife had set down, turned it once in his scarred hand, and broke it open. Steam rose from the dark crust into the cold air. He did not offer an explanation. He only reached into his coat, drew out a small leather pouch, and let a stream of raw gold fall onto the trading post scale, far more than any loaf, any dozen loaves, had ever been worth. That was the moment the whole yard would remember, though it would take years before anyone understood what it meant. But to reach that moment honestly, the story must go back 6 weeks earlier, before the stranger, before the gold, to the hour when the widow rose each morning, while the township still slept beneath frost. She woke at 4, in the dark, in the cold, that came down off the mountains, and settled into the cracks of the cabin like something alive. She did not light a lamp at first. She did not need one. Her hands knew the crock before her eyes could find it, a squat clay jar with a lid cracked clean across, mended once with pitch that had long since dried and flaked. It sat on the shelf above the stove where the last of the night's warmth might reach it, and she fed it flour and water every morning without fail, the way another woman might tend a grave. She had carried that habit for 6 years now, since a fever took her husband on the trail west and left her with 2 boys, and a starter he had shown her how to keep alive, with more patience than he had ever shown for anything else in his short life. The elder boy, 9, always woke when she did, though she never asked him to. He would sit near the stove with his knees drawn up, watching her work the dough with hands that had gone rough and thick with the years, watching the way she scored the loaves before they went into the low, smoking heat of the oven her husband had built from river stone before he died. The younger boy, 6, slept through most of it, curled under a horse blanket that had been patched so many times it no longer resembled its original color. She baked the same way every morning, the way she had learned it on the trail, over low coals banked with green wood, so the smoke curled thick and slow around the dough, and blackened the crust dark as a stovepipe. It was not pretty bread, she knew that. The outside came out scorched and misshapen, humped where the heat had run uneven, and no woman in Mabel Township had ever once complimented the look of it. But it did not mold in a week the way clean bread did, and it kept a man's belly full through a day of work he might not otherwise have survived, and that had mattered more on the trail than any woman's opinion of how a loaf ought to look sitting in a basket. She wrapped the loaves in cloth while they were still warm enough to steam, loaded the basket onto her hip, and walked the half-mile into town before the sun had fully cleared the ridge, because a widow with 2 sons and no husband's wage did not have the luxury of waiting for daylight to decide whether the morning was worth beginning. The trading post porch sat at the low end of the street, where the mud ruts from the freight wagons pooled deepest and froze hardest, and by the time she reached it, the September cold had settled into her hands in a way that made the joints ache before the work even began. She set the basket down on the planking and did not sit. There was water to haul first, 2 buckets from the trough behind the post, and she carried them the way she carried everything, with her shoulders squared and her breath fogging out in front of her like something alive that wanted to escape before she did. The starter waited at home in its clay crock, cracked along the lid where her husband had dropped it once outside Independence and mended it with pitch, and she had fed it every morning for 6 years without missing a single one, not the morning he died of fever, not the morning after. A cup of flour, a splash of water, her hand working it in the gray light before the boys woke, because a starter left hungry too long went sour, and a sour starter meant no bread, and no bread meant no coin, and no coin meant nothing at all, for 2 growing sons in a township that had already decided what she was worth. Wood smoke hung low over the street that morning, flattened by the cold, drifting off the chimneys of the houses that had fires already going, and it mixed with the smell of horse, and wet canvas, and the particular mineral bite of frost on iron. She breathed it in, without noticing she did. Her hands moved on their own by now, shaping the dough she'd carried wrapped and risen, working each loaf into rough rounds with a competence that came only from repetition, from thousands of mornings strung end to end, though nobody watching would have called it competence. They would have called it, if they called it anything, the labor of a fat woman with no husband, hunched over a basket in the cold. The green wood smoked the way it always did, thick and slow, curling up from the low coals she'd banked before leaving the cabin, and by the time she set the last loaf to its place, the sky over the ridge had gone from black to the color of old ash. Her back ached in the particular way it ached every morning, low and dull, and she straightened once, briefly, pressing a fist there before bending again. A man came out from the post to sweep the porch and did not look at her. She did not expect him to. She had long since stopped expecting anyone in Mabel Township to look at her as anything other than a shape in the way, and she had made her peace with that the same winter she had made her peace with widowhood, quietly, without ceremony, because grief and humiliation both were luxuries a woman in her position could not afford to indulge past sunrise. The talk that morning was not of her bread. It rarely was, this early, before the wives had gathered to make their sport of it. This morning the talk was of the valley itself, passed low between the 2 clerks stacking flour sacks inside the post, their voices carrying out through the propped door, the way voices did in the thin, cold air, farther than they meant them to. There was a man, they said, who had come into the county in July, and no one had gotten a clean look at his face since. He kept to the high pasture on the old Meacham place, the one that had gone under 2 winters back, and from there, it was said, he had begun buying paper on failing homesteads all through the valley, the Dorrance place, the Kettering claim, a strip of bottomland near the fork that 3 families had fought over before the drought settled it for them. He paid in gold, and always through the county land office, and the name on the deeds was Whitlock, though nobody in Mabel Township had ever heard of a Whitlock family, not from the territory, not from anywhere east of it either. She listened without seeming to, the way a woman learns to listen when she is standing in a place she has not been invited to occupy. One of the clerks said the man was said to be enormous, taller than any 2 men put together, though the other laughed at that and said it was only the kind of thing people said about a stranger nobody had looked at closely. The way a shadow grows larger, the less light falls on it. He was scarred bad, they agreed on that much. A hand had seen him once at the land office counter, seen the mark of it running up one forearm, and along the jaw, like something had tried to open him and failed. Nobody knew where the scars came from. Nobody knew where the gold came from either. And that was the part that seemed to trouble the postmaster most, when he came shuffling out with his ledger under his arm and overheard the same talk his clerks were making. A man who paid honest gold for worthless land and never showed his face to collect on it was not, in the postmaster's experience, a man with nothing to hide. She thought little of it then, standing over her basket with her hands still smelling of smoke and rising dough, because the failing of 3 farms and the buying of their paper was not a thing that touched her directly, not the way an empty flour bin touched her, or a boy's stomach growling under a thin coat. But she filed it away regardless, the way she filed away all things that might someday matter and mostly did not. A rancher without a face, gold without an explanation, a name that fit no family anyone could account for, and went back to setting her loaves in their crooked row, the char on their crusts catching the first real light of the morning, like something trying, in its own scorched way, to be noticed. They came the way they always came, in a cluster of 3, then 4, their shawls pulled tight against the September chill, their boots finding the same worn path they walked every morning to the trading post as though the ground itself expected them. The postmaster's wife led them, as she always led them, thin as a fence rail and twice as sharp, her eyes already narrowing on the basket before her feet had fully stopped. She did not greet the widow, she never did. Greeting implied an equal, and there was nothing in her bearing that suggested she believed one stood before her. She reached down instead and lifted one of the loaves by its corner, holding it at arm's length as though it might soil her glove, turning it in the thin morning light so that its blackened crust caught every eye that had gathered near the scales, and the mail slot, and the barrels of nails. "Look at the shape of it," she said, to no one and to everyone, like a dog got at it before the oven did. A ripple of laughter went through the small crowd, the kind that costs nothing and asks nothing of the ones who give it. One of the other wives leaned in to sniff at the loaf and drew back with a theatrical shudder, declaring it smelled of a chimney fire, and another wondered aloud, loud enough to carry, whether the widow had simply given up trying and begun selling her mistakes instead of throwing them to the hogs. The widow said nothing. She had learned, across 2 winters of standing behind this basket, that silence cost her less than defense. But her hands, folded before her apron, tightened at the knuckle. The postmaster's wife set the loaf back down, not gently, so that it struck the edge of the basket and rolled half onto the dirt, and she wiped her glove against her skirt as though the contact itself required cleaning. "A woman ought to be ashamed," she said, "selling this to decent people. There are children in this township eating what she calls bread." Somewhere behind a stacked line of feed barrels, a boy of 9 watched with his jaw set hard and still, the way his father used to hold his jaw before he spoke a thing he meant. The crowd had grown by then to a dozen or more, drawn the way crowds are always drawn to another person's shame, and the widow felt the weight of their eyes settle on her, the same way frost settles on a window, slow and total, and impossible to wipe away with a hand. She kept her gaze on the loaf lying in the dirt, on the char that had, only moments before, seemed to her like something trying to be noticed. It had been noticed now, just not in the way she had hoped. She bent to retrieve it, brushing the dust from its crust with 2 fingers, and it was in that motion, low and small and unremarked upon, that the morning's true audience arrived, unhurried, unannounced, his shadow falling long and sudden across the basket before anyone thought to look up and see him standing there. The shadow did not move at first. It only lay there across the basket, long as a fence rail, and the crowd's murmuring thinned, the way water thins when it meets cold air, going quiet and still, without anyone deciding to be quiet. She looked up along the shadow's length and found the man who cast it, taller than the post office door, a forearm ridged with old scar tissue, where the sleeve had been rolled to the elbow, a jaw marked by a thin white seam that ran from ear to chin like a crack in dry clay. He wore no hat. His eyes, pale as creek water in winter, moved once over the crowd, then settled on the loaf still cradled in her 2 hands, dust clinging to its crust where she had failed to brush it clean. He did not speak to the postmaster's wife. He did not speak to anyone gathered there, though several of them had gone very still, the way people go still around livestock they have not yet decided is safe. He crouched instead, slow, his knees cracking audibly in the cold morning air, and put out one scarred hand toward the basket. She did not pull it back. Something in the stillness of him did not ask her to. He lifted a second loaf, turned it once in his palm, weighing it the way a man weighs a stone he intends to skip across water. He pressed his thumb into the blackened crust, and it gave, not crumbling, but yielding the way tough leather yields. And beneath the char the bread showed pale and dense, and threaded faintly with something darker, some grain within the grain. He raised it to his face and breathed in, slow, through the nose, his eyes half closing the way a man's eyes close when a smell reaches further back into him than he intends to let it. "What's in the crust?" he said. It was not a question shaped like other men's questions, curious or mocking. It came out flat, like a man reading a number off a scale. She did not answer right away. She had grown used to defending the bread, not explaining it, and the difference sat strange in her mouth. "Wheat smoked over green wood," she said finally. "2 days. My husband learned it crossing from Missouri. Keeps longer that way. Travels better." He said nothing to that. He only nodded once, small, as though she had confirmed something he had already known before he asked, and turned the loaf again in his hand, studying the char, the way another man might study a brand burned into a hide, searching for the mark of a particular iron. Behind the feed barrels, the boy of 9 leaned forward without knowing he did it, watching the stranger's face the way a person watches weather building at the edge of a valley, uncertain, yet whether it would pass on by or break open right there above them. The postmaster's wife opened her mouth to speak again, and for the first time that morning, found she had nothing ready to say. He set the loaf down on the plank counter, not roughly, but with the care a man uses when he does not yet trust his own hands around a thing he wants. Then he asked how many she had brought that morning. She told him. 11 loaves, all scorched the same dark brown, all lined up on the cloth, like a row of stones pulled from a riverbed. "I'll take them," he said. "All of them." The words did not travel fast through the crowd at first, the way a stone does not travel fast through water, but the ripple came, wife to wife, man to man, until even the mules tied at the rail seemed to lean their ears toward the counter. 11 loaves was more bread than any household in Mabel Township bought in a month. He had not asked the price. He had not haggled, the way even the wealthiest ranchers haggled out of habit, out of the frontier custom that said a man who did not haggle was either drunk or simple. He was neither, though the postmaster's wife's face suggested she was already composing which word she would use once he was out of earshot. He drew a pouch from inside his coat, worn soft at the seams, and set it on the trading post scale himself before the postmaster could reach for it. The postmaster startled, hand half raised, and said something about weighing being his job, sir, his responsibility under the post's charter, but the rancher only looked at him, and the look did the work that words might have taken longer to do. The postmaster's hand dropped back to the counter. Raw gold dust hissed thin and pale into the brass pan, and the little balance arm tipped and steadied, and the whole gathered crowd watched it the way they might have watched a hanging, with a silence that was not respectful so much as hungry for an ending. The postmaster read the weight aloud, voice unsteady, and it was a sum that made 2 of the wives near the flour barrels draw in breath through their teeth. It was more than the bread was worth. It was more than the bread would ever be worth, scorched or otherwise, more than a month of loaves, more than most families in the township saw in gold from one season to the next. That can't be right," the postmaster's wife said, though her voice had lost its earlier sharpness and gone thin instead, the way ice goes thin before it gives. The rancher did not answer her. He gathered the 11 loaves into the crook of one scarred arm, the way another man might carry firewood, and looked once more at the widow, whose hands had gone still at her sides, unsure, yet whether to be grateful or afraid, of a kindness that arrived with no explanation attached. Behind the feed barrels, the boy watched the gold vanish into the postmaster's strongbox, and understood, in the plain arithmetic of a 9-year-old, that something had shifted in the order of things, though he could not yet have said what, only that his mother's bread, mocked not 10 minutes before, was now being carried away like something precious, by a man too large for the doorway he ducked through on his way out. That night, the cabin held its heat poorly, as it always did once October came close, and the widow banked the fire low and set the lamp on the table between them, the flame guttering each time wind found the gap beneath the door. The boy sat across from her, elbows on the wood, still too excited for sleep, and she found herself telling him about the gold before she had decided whether telling him was wise. She described the way the rancher had not haggled, had not asked a price, had simply set the leather pouch on the postmaster's scale and waited while it was weighed, and how the number that came back had made even the postmaster's wife go quiet. The boy wanted to know why. She did not have an answer that satisfied either of them, so instead she told him what she knew for certain, which was less about the rancher and more about the bread itself. She told him, as she had told him pieces of before, but never whole, about the trail west, about the wagon her husband had driven through country so dry the wheels cracked, and about the winter they had nearly not survived it. Not this winter, not any winter the boy remembered, but the one before he was born, when flour had to be stretched thin and burned hard on purpose, because a loaf scorched dark and dense would keep a week longer than a soft one, would not mold in the damp, would carry them from one water crossing to the next. Her husband had learned the method from an old teamster somewhere past the Platte, she said, a way of working smoke into the dough itself, not just the crust, so the bread tasted of fire even at its center. He had taught it to her over a low coal fire one night, guiding her hands more than his words, because he was not a man given to long speech even then. She did not tell the boy everything about the fever that took him 2 winters past, only that it had come fast, in the cold months, and that the one thing she had carried out of that sickness besides the 2 of them was the clay crock with the cracked lid, sitting even now on the shelf above the wash basin, its starter fed every morning without fail for 6 years, rain or grief or sickness of her own notwithstanding. That crock, she told the boy, was the last living thing of his father that she had left, more than the grave marker, more than the few tools still hung by the door. The bread the town mocked was not a failure of her hands. It was the only inheritance the boy would ever have of a man he had been too young to remember clearly, kept alive one feeding at a time, one scorched loaf at a time, whether or not the town understood what it was looking at. The boy said nothing for a long while, only looked toward the shelf where the crock sat in shadow, and then asked, quietly, if the rancher would come back. He came back, though the boy would not know that for 3 more days, and when he came, he did not come for the bread alone, though he did not know how to say that either. The taste had done something to him, the first bite that he had not expected and could not have explained to anyone in that trading post, least of all to the postmaster's wife, with her thin mouth and her arithmetic of shame. He had chewed the scorched crust slowly, the way a man chews when he is not sure if he is eating or remembering, and the smoke of it had gone through him like a hand reaching backward through 14 years, to a night on the Sweetwater, when the wagon party's flour had run out, and the meat had run out, and the children had stopped crying, because they no longer had the strength for it. There had been a woman then, too. He did not remember her face anymore, only her hands, cracked and reddened from the cold, working dough with river water, because there was nothing else, and baking it too long, too hard, over coals banked low so the loaves would keep another day, another 2 days, however long it took to reach the fort. The bread had come out black on the outside, and dense as a stone within, and the other families had grumbled at first, the way people grumble when they are frightened, and do not yet understand what they are looking at. But she had kept baking it, night after night, rationing what little grain remained, feeding a starter she guarded like a second child, and by the time they reached the fort, there were still 11 of them alive who might not otherwise have been. He had been 7 years old. He had not known her name. He had watched her hands more than her face, the way a hungry child watches the hands that feed him, and somewhere in the years since, the cattle drives, the war, the scars he did not speak of, her hands had become a kind of ledger in him, an accounting of debt he had never been able to close, because he had never found her again, never learned what had become of her, never had the chance to put anything into her palm, the way she had put bread into his. He understood. chewing that first scorched loaf outside the trading post while the women laughed, that he had found something that rhymed with her, if not her herself. It was not sentiment, exactly, that made him lay the gold dust on the scale. It was closer to repayment, delayed 14 years, and misdirected onto a stranger who happened to carry the same scorched wisdom in her hands. He did not tell the postmaster this. He did not tell anyone. He only counted out the dust, watched it weighed, and walked back toward the ranch with the bread wrapped in cloth against his chest, already knowing he would return the following week, and the week after that, for reasons he had not yet found words to hold. The following week arrived with a hard frost silvering the ruts along the trading post road, and she was there before dawn again, her breath a pale ribbon in the lantern light, the loaves cooling on the plank, in rows she had learned to count without looking. 9 of them. She had baked 9, because 9 was what the flour allowed, and she had learned in 6 years of widowhood not to hope for more than what the flour allowed. He came at the same hour as before, unhurried, his shadow long across the frozen mud before his boots were close enough to hear. He did not speak. He set the sack down, and the boy behind the barrel, the elder one, 9 himself, sharp-eyed in the way of children who have learned to watch adults for signs of danger, leaned forward to see whether the stranger would do again what he had done the week prior. He bought the whole batch, all 9 loaves, wrapped and stacked into his arms like cordwood, and he carried them to the scale himself this time, setting his own pouch of gold dust beside the postmaster's brass weights, without a word of instruction. The postmaster's hands were quick. They had always been quick, in the way of a man accustomed to small dishonesties that no one troubled to notice, a thumb pressed here, a weight nudged there, the scale's arm settling a hair short of true. He had done it to farmers who could not read numbers, and to widows who could not afford to argue. He did it now, sliding 2 fingers beneath the pan as he lifted it, and he might have gotten away with it entirely had the rancher not been watching his hands instead of his face, the way a man watches an animal's feet instead of its eyes, to know which way it means to bolt. The rancher's own hand came down over the postmaster's, not hard, but final, pinning it flat against the counter. He said nothing for a long moment. The postmaster's face had gone the color of tallow. "Weigh it again," the rancher said. "Empty pan first. Let the woman watch." The words were plain, without heat, but they carried into every corner of the trading post, and the wives who had gathered again that morning to see whether the stranger's foolishness would repeat itself fell quiet, sensing that something had shifted beneath the surface of the ordinary transaction they had come to mock. The postmaster reweighed it. Empty pan, then gold, then bread. Each step performed slowly under the rancher's unmoving hand, and the true weight came out heavier than the first reading by nearly a quarter ounce, enough to matter to a woman counting flour by the cup. He said nothing further. He simply took his bread, nodded once toward her, and left the extra dust uncollected on the scale, a small, unspoken correction that the postmaster would remember longer than any word of reproach could have made him. She watched him go, the boy watching beside her, and neither of them yet understood that they had just witnessed the first proof of a man who paid every debt in full, even the ones no one had asked him to notice. By the 3rd week, the pattern had hardened into something the township could set its clock by. He came on the same morning, at the same hour, when the frost still silvered the wagon ruts, and the smoke from the trading post chimney hung low and reluctant in the cold air. He bought the whole batch, every scorched loaf she had wrapped in cloth that morning before the sun cleared the ridge, and he paid in gold weighed honest now, the postmaster's hands no longer trembling with the temptation to shave a grain here or there. The boy had taken to counting the days between visits on his fingers, a private arithmetic of anticipation he did not share even with his brother. But a pattern noticed by a child is noticed twice over by a woman with nothing else to occupy her mind, and the postmaster's wife had begun to watch the widow the way a hawk watches a field it has already decided holds something worth taking. 3 weeks now, she said one morning, not to Ruth directly, but to the air beside her, in the particular voice women use when they want a thing overheard, without the trouble of having said it. A man doesn't ride 4 miles for bread, not bread like that. She let the pause do its work, her eyes moving over Ruth's flour-dusted apron, her reddened hands, the loaves still steaming faintly on the cloth. Unless there's some other appetite being fed. The women near her laughed the small, careful laugh of people who wish to seem amused without committing to the joke. Ruth felt the heat climb her neck before she could stop it, and she hated herself for the flush more than she hated the words that caused it. "He pays for bread," she said. "That's the whole of it." "Of course," the postmaster's wife said, in the tone of a woman agreeing to something she has already decided is false. "Of course it is." She did not press further that day. She did not need to. The suggestion had been planted the way a good farmer plants, not carelessly scattered, but pressed into soil already turned, where it would take root without further tending. By the end of the week, it had traveled through the township in the particular manner of things too shameful to be spoken outright and too delicious to be left unspoken. A murmur here, a raised brow there, a silence that fell when Ruth passed, that had not fallen before. She said nothing to the boy about it, though she suspected he heard more than she wished. She kept baking. She kept feeding the starter each morning before dawn, the crock warm under her palm, her husband's voice a faint and steadying thing beneath the ache of being watched, weighed, and found wanting all over again, this time not for her bread, but for the simple, unbearable fact of being noticed by a man who had never once asked anything of her beyond the honest price of what she made. The postmaster came to her on a Tuesday, when the trading post was empty of customers and the stove ticked in the corner like something counting down. He had not called her over. He had simply found reasons to linger near her table while she packed her unsold loaves into the burlap sack, straightening ledgers that did not need straightening, until the silence between them grew heavier than either of them wanted to carry alone. "You ought to know something," he said finally, not looking at her. His hands moved a stack of receipts, an inch to the left, then back, since folks are saying things. She waited. She had learned, in 6 years of widowhood, that waiting cost nothing, and often bought more than asking. Man's not what they think. He glanced toward the door, as though the rancher might materialize from the cold to overhear his own defense. "Last winter, before you'd have known him, before he was even properly settled, 3 families out past the North Ridge were set to lose their claims. Bank in the county seat had the papers drawn. Foreclosure, all 3, same week, dead of January." He said the word. Dead. The way men said it about weather, not people, though everyone understood what a foreclosure meant in a winter like that one had been. Somebody paid the notes off, anonymous, paid in full, quiet, through a lawyer in Cheyenne who wouldn't give a name to anybody, not even the bank. Ruth kept folding the sack's edge over itself, though her hands had slowed. "Took me till last week to work it out," the postmaster said. "The lawyer's clerk came through here in the fall, asking after a man matching his description, big through the shoulders, scarred along the jaw. I didn't think on it again till I weighed his gold myself and saw how he carries it, like a man used to paying for things without being thanked for it." He finally looked at her. "He's letting those families stay on as tenants, never raised the rent past what the bank was charging. Never told them who he was either. I don't believe he's told anyone." She thought of the gold dust settling on the scale's brass pan, the deliberate way he had watched the needle, the flatness of his voice when he'd said, "Weigh it again." Not a man protecting his own interest. A man who understood, more precisely than anyone in Mabel Township, exactly what a cheated scale could cost a person who had nothing else to stand on. "Why tell me this?" she said. The postmaster shrugged, uncomfortable, already retreating toward his ledgers. Didn't seem right, letting them call him a swindler behind his back. Not to a woman he's been fair with, he did not say. And not fair to you either. Though the words sat unspoken between them, close enough to touch. Ruth carried the sack out into the cold without answering, the crock's warmth still faint against her palm from that morning's feeding, and did not know, walking home through the frost-hard ruts, whether what she felt was relief or a deeper and more dangerous kind of hope. He came the following Thursday at dusk instead of morning, which was itself a kind of announcement, since he had never once broken the pattern of 11 weeks. She was scraping the last of the day's ash from the oven mouth when she heard his horse, and she did not turn around right away, letting the iron scraper finish its work, giving her hands something to do besides shake. "Postmaster tell you," he said, "not a question." He did. The porch boards held the cold of the day in them, and she felt it through her shoes as she stood and faced him. He had not dismounted. He sat there with the reins slack in his scarred hand, looking at her the way he looked at the scale, steady, unhurried, waiting for the true weight of something to settle. "It's true then," she said. "The name." "It's not my name," he said. "Never was. Wasn't running from the law. Wasn't running from anything a man ought to be ashamed of." He paused, and the pause went on long enough that she thought he might simply ride off into it. Just didn't want to be looked at the way men look at money. Rather be looked at the way they look at a stranger who buys too much bread. She waited. 19 of us, he said finally, and his voice had gone flatter, the way it did over the scale. Wagon party out of Missouri, winter of '51. Lost the stock to a river crossing, lost the flour with it. He looked past her, at the dark shape of the oven, not at her face. There was a woman, cooked what little grain we'd saved over green wood, low and slow, so it'd keep. Came out black on the outside, bitter, near burnt through. His jaw worked once, kept 9 of us alive to the far side of the mountains. I was 7. The wind moved through the yard, carrying the smell of wood smoke from her own low fire, and she understood, standing there, that he had not come to explain the gold, or the deeds, or the name. He had come to say this one thing, and the rest had simply been the road he'd had to walk to reach it. "She didn't live to see spring," he said. "Nobody remembers her name. I've asked, over the years. Nobody kept it. And mine," Ruth said quietly, "tastes the same." "Tastes like being alive when you shouldn't be," he said it plainly, without softening, the way he said everything, and swung down from the horse at last, boots striking the frozen yard with a sound that seemed to settle something between them. "Didn't come here for the bread," he said. "Not anymore. Come because I don't know how else to sit near a thing that matters without paying for it." She did not answer that. She only opened the door wider, and the lamplight fell across the yard between them, thin and gold, and neither of them moved to close the distance it measured. She stepped back from the door and let him pass into the warmth, and he came in the way he did everything, slow and deliberate, as if the room itself required his permission to hold a man his size. The lamp on the table threw his shadow long against the wall, and he took off his hat and set it on the floor by the chair leg, and sat. She had not planned to feed him. There was only the one loaf left from the morning's batch, set aside under a cloth for the boys' breakfast, and she brought it out anyway, because there was nothing else in the house that seemed right to put in front of him, and because some old instinct told her that a man who had walked this far into a thing did not deserve an empty table. She set the loaf down. He looked at it the way another man might look at a letter from home. He did not cut it. He broke it, both scarred hands closing around the crust, the sound of it splitting dry and sharp in the quiet room, and he held the 2 halves apart a moment before he ate, as though he were giving the smell time to reach him first. He chewed slowly. He did not speak while he did it. The fire ticked in the low stove, and the wind pushed once against the shutters and settled, and she watched him eat the way she might have watched weather come in over the ridge, something too large to hurry, something that would finish in its own time and not before. From behind the flour barrel in the corner, her elder boy watched too, the way he had watched the first purchase outside the trading post, still and quiet, understanding without being told that this was not a thing to interrupt. He had grown taller since that day. He noticed things now that he had not noticed then, the way the man's jaw worked, the way his throat moved when he swallowed, the particular stillness of his shoulders, as if eating were a task he had learned to do carefully, because there had been years when careless eating meant nothing left for morning. Neither Ruth nor the boy said anything. The lamp burned a little lower, and the tallow smell mixed with the smoked wheat smell of the broken loaf, and outside the cold pressed itself against the window glass without getting in. When he finished, he set the 2 halves of crust back together on the table, edges not quite meeting. as if some part of him meant to preserve the shape of it a moment longer before it was gone entirely. He looked at his own hands. He did not look at her. "Your husband taught you right," he said, and it was not a compliment so much as a fact laid down between them, plain as a plank set across a gap meant to be walked on. She said nothing, but she noticed, for the first time in a long while, that her hands had stopped moving, folded still in her lap, waiting. He came back 3 days later with men she did not know, riding behind him on a wagon loaded with rough-sawn lumber still pale and wet at the cut edges, and he did not ask permission before setting them to work on the lean-to that had sagged against the north wall of her cabin since the spring thaw 2 years past. The men were quiet the way he was quiet, moving with the economy of people accustomed to labor that mattered, and she learned, without being told, that they were the ones from the 3 farms, men who had woken one winter to find their debts paid and their names still on the deeds, and who did not ask questions of the man who had done it. They pulled the rotted posts first, working them loose with iron bars, the wood coming away in soft, dark handfuls where the damp had gotten into it, and they stacked the ruined timber to one side for burning. The frost had not yet closed the ground, and they dug new post holes before it could, the dirt coming up in clods that steamed faintly in the cold morning air. She brought them water and, later, bread, not the good loaves, the misshapen heels from the batch that hadn't sold, and they ate standing, working the whole time, the way men eat who do not consider a meal a reason to stop. The rancher set the first post himself, sighting along it with one eye closed, adjusting it a finger's width before he was satisfied, and then he held it steady with one scarred hand, while a younger man tamped the earth around its base with the flat of a shovel. He did this for each post in turn, patient as weather, saying almost nothing beyond the occasional word. "There. Hold. Very good." And the boy watched from the woodpile with the ledger book he had started keeping, marking down the lumber tally in a careful, uneven hand, because someone, he had decided without being asked, ought to know what things cost. By the second day they had raised a new frame square and true where the old one had leaned, and by the third they were laying board over the gaps, overlapping them against the wind, the way a man overlaps shingles who has slept too many winters in structures that didn't. The rancher worked bareheaded despite the cold, his breath showing white, the muscles of his forearm cording and releasing beneath the old scar tissue with each swing of the hammer. And once, when a nail bent under his blow, he did not curse, only pulled it and set another, unhurried, as if the day owed him nothing and he owed it everything. She stood in the doorway some hours and watched the shape of her ruined bakery become, board by board, something that might hold heat again before the snow came, and she found she had nothing to say that would not sound smaller than the sound of the hammers. The talk started the way talk in Mabel Township always started, not at the trading post, where a man might have to answer for what he said, but over wash lines and fence rails, where words could be dropped like seed and left to grow unattended. It reached her first, through the boy, who came home from the mercantile with his jaw set wrong and would not say why until she pressed him twice, and then he told her, flat and furious, in the way of a child repeating something he does not fully understand, but knows to be poison. The postmaster's wife had said it to 3 women at once, near the flour barrels, her voice pitched low enough to seem private and loud enough to carry, that no man paid gold for bread unless he was getting something else besides, that a woman, built like a barrel, didn't catch a man like that with baking, that there were ways a widow alone might keep herself fed through a hard winter that had nothing to do with yeast. Ruth heard the rest of it secondhand over the following days, each version crueler than the last, the way rumor sharpens itself on repetition. She had bewitched him, she had seduced him for his deeds, she had known who he was all along, and set her cap for his money before the frame of her bakery had even come down. The women who said it did not say it to her face. They never did. That was the particular cowardice of it. But they said it loud enough near the well, near the church steps, near the schoolhouse door, where her younger boy stood waiting some afternoons, and it came home to her in pieces, the way smoke finds a room, through cracks it did not need permission to enter. She stood over the starter crock one evening, feeding it by lamplight as she had every night for 6 years, and let herself feel the shape of what they were offering her. An old, familiar shape, cruelty dressed as concern, and beneath it, the invitation to answer in kind, to say something sharp enough about the postmaster's wife's own thin marriage, her own hungry silences, that would travel just as fast and land just as hard. Ruth knew things. 6 years of selling bread at a public counter taught a woman things about every household in a township, who paid late, who drank, who wept behind a smile. She could have ruined the woman's name in an afternoon with half the truth she carried. She scraped the crock's edge clean instead, fed the starter its cup of water and its cup of flour, and pressed the cracked lid back down over it, the way her husband had shown her, snug but not sealed, so the thing inside could breathe. She decided nothing that night, but she noted, the way she noted weather, that the choice was there waiting, and that whichever way she turned it would follow her into whatever the bakery became. The frost came early that week, silvering the boards of the trading post porch before sunrise, and she rose in the dark to knead dough with hands that ached before the work even began. She did not answer the rumor. She did not visit the postmaster's wife's kitchen to trade word for word, did not send either of her boys with a message sharpened at the edges. Instead, she rose earlier, ground her wheat finer, watched the coals of her outdoor oven with a patience that bordered on prayer, and on the morning the rumor was 3 days old, she carried out a batch larger than any she had baked before. 22 loaves, dark-crusted, dense with the smoked wheat flavor that had become, without her intending it, a kind of signature. She set them on the plank counter and did not look up when the first customers came, though she heard the low murmur that trailed behind her now wherever she stood, a current running under the ordinary business of the post. Grain sales, mail, gossip about a Sunday sermon. She heard, too, without straining for it, the particular note of the postmaster's wife's voice, somewhere near the flour barrels, pitched to Carrie, saying something about desperate women and the company they kept, about a widow who ought to know her place among decent families. The rancher was weighing a sack of nails at the counter's far end. He did not turn his head quickly. He finished setting the sack down, the way a man finishes a task before starting another, and then he looked toward the flour barrels with an expression that held no anger in it, only a kind of settled attention, as though he were reading brand marks on cattle and had found one he recognized. "She sells good bread," he said, not loud, plain, the way he said most things, a man unaccustomed to spending words he didn't need. "Better than most I've had. That's the whole of what I know about her, and the whole of what needs saying." The murmur did not stop entirely, but it thinned, the way wind thins passing over open ground, losing its force without a wall to push against. The postmaster's wife's mouth tightened, and she found something urgent to attend to among the mail slots, her back very straight, and no one at the counter met her eye to invite her back into the conversation. Ruth kept counting loaves into a customer's basket, her fingers steady, her face unreadable to anyone watching, though her elder son, crouched again near the barrel, where he had learned to make himself small and useful at once, saw the corner of her mouth move. Not quite a smile, something more private than that, the look of a woman noting that a debt had been marked down somewhere she could not see, to be settled at a time not yet named. The lumber came in the second week of October, 6 wagon loads of it, cut pine, still weeping sap, stacked and roped and hauled down from a mill 2 counties east, because there was none closer. It arrived on a Tuesday morning with frost still silvering the wagon ruts, and men she had never spoken to climbed down from the seats and began unloading it without being told twice where to put it, because the tall rancher had already told them once, the night before, in whatever plain sentences he used to tell men things. They were tenants from the 3 farms, she came to understand, men who owed him nothing on paper, but everything in the way that mattered on a hard winter ledger, and who worked now with the particular thoroughness of men repaying something they could not otherwise repay. The millstone came 4 days later, hauled from the county seat on a flatbed, pulled by a team of oxen that strained visibly on the last rise before town, their breath fogging thick in the cold. It was granite, gray and pitted, larger than anything she had imagined when the word Mill had first been spoken aloud between them, and when it was finally lowered onto its bed of timber, the whole structure seemed to settle an inch into the earth, as though the ground itself acknowledged the weight of what was being built there. Her elder son took to the ledger without being asked twice either. He found a stub of pencil and a ruled book meant for something else entirely, and he began marking columns in a careful, uneven hand. Gold weighed against loaves sold, lumber cost against days of labor, flour promised against flour delivered, sitting cross-legged on an overturned crate near the framing, with the book balanced on his knee, tongue caught between his teeth in concentration. He did not ask why the numbers mattered. He simply understood. The way children raised close to hunger understand such things early, that a household's survival was arithmetic before it was anything else, and that someone had to keep the sum honest. She watched him some evenings from the doorway of what would be the mill, flour still dusting her forearms, and thought of her husband's cracked crock kept warm behind the stove, and of how a family's ledger could be kept in more than one kind of book. The storm came without the courtesy of warning, the way early snow on the high plains always did, arriving on a wind that had felt merely cold at dusk and turned vicious by full dark. She heard it first in the way the canvas stretched over the unfinished roof beams began to snap instead of hum, a sound like something tearing that wasn't yet torn. By the time she reached the mill with a lantern cupped against the gusts, he was already there, having felt the same change in the air from his cabin a half-mile off, standing beneath the skeleton of rafters with his coat already crusted white. "Roof won't hold," he said. Nothing more. He did not need to say what would happen to the grain sacks stacked along the north wall if it didn't, or to the flour barrels, or to the crock. They worked without speaking after that, because speaking cost breath they needed elsewhere. He hauled the canvas taut and lashed it with rope meant for a job 3 weeks distant, driving pegs into half-frozen ground with the flat of an axe, while she carried sacks 2 at a time toward the center of the floor, away from the walls where wind found every seam. Her arms burned. She did not stop. The lantern threw her shadow huge and shuddering against the raw boards, and once she slipped on a rime of ice already forming along the threshold and went down hard on one knee, and he was there before she'd finished falling, one hand under her arm lifting her as if she weighed nothing at all, which she did not, and neither of them remarked on it. The crock she carried last, wrapped in her own shawl, and held against her chest, the way she had once carried her younger son through a fever night, because a starter could not survive freezing any better than a child could, and 6 years of daily feeding did not forgive a single lost night to the cold. She set it in the warmest corner she could find, near the stove they had not yet had cause to light, and packed straw around it with fingers that had stopped feeling their own shape. By the time the wind eased toward morning, the roof still stood, sagging but whole, and the grain was dry, and the crock sat undisturbed beneath its nest of straw. He looked at it a long moment, said nothing, and began coiling the spare rope as though the night had been ordinary labor and nothing more. By the first week of December, the millstone had settled into its rhythm, a low grinding hum that carried across the flat morning air, like the township's own pulse, and the flour that came from beneath it was unlike anything the county had tasted. It was darker than store flour, flecked with the char that had once drawn laughter, and it baked into bread with a smoke sweetness that lingered on the tongue long after the crust had gone. Word of it did not travel by design. It traveled the way such things always did on the frontier, a wagon driver from the county seat tasting a heel of bread at the trading post counter, asking where the flour had come from, then returning 3 weeks later with 2 others and a wagon bed lined with empty sacks. She weighed their orders herself, her boy at the ledger beside her, his pencil careful and slow, the numbers still new to his hand but never wrong twice. The traders did not haggle the way the town wives once had over a burnt loaf. They paid what she asked, some in coin, one in a bolt of good wool cloth she folded away for winter coats before she let herself think what it might mean to no longer measure every yard against hunger. The postmaster took to mentioning her name now when strangers came through asking after flour, and he said it the way a man says a fact he is proud to have witnessed firsthand, though he had witnessed, in truth, mostly his own early stinginess corrected in front of others. She did not remind him of it. There was no profit in old grievances when there was flour to bag and a mill to run. What she noticed most, in those first weeks of December, was not the money, though the money mattered, but the way the trading post door swung differently when she walked through it. Not thrown wide in mockery, not held shut in dismissal, but opened by someone's hand, who wanted a word with her, a moment of her attention, as though her attention itself had become a thing of value. She had spent 6 years being looked past. Now she was looked toward, and the sensation sat strangely in her chest, unfamiliar as a new coat, not yet trusted to keep out the cold. The rancher said little of it. He came each week still, bought his share, weighed his gold, and watched her work the ledger with her son, as though it were the most ordinary sight in the world, a woman being paid what she was worth. January came in hard, the way it always came to that country, without patience for those unprepared for it. The snow fell for 6 days without pause, and when it stopped, the cold that followed was worse than the snow itself, a cold that cracked the water barrels and drove even the hardiest cattle to huddle against the leeward side of the barns. The trading post's shelves, never generous even in fat months, went bare by the second week. Flour ran out first. Then salt. Then the dried beans that had carried lean households through worse winters than this one. She heard the knock before she saw who made it, and when she opened the mill door, the cold came in with them, a cluster of women wrapped in shawls too thin for the weather, their faces raw and unpracticed at asking for anything. The postmaster's wife stood at the front, though not the way she had stood at the trading post scale months before, chin lifted and voice sharpened for an audience. She stood now with her hands folded inside her sleeves, her eyes fixed somewhere near the floor. Neither of them spoke first. The silence held long enough that the younger boy, who had been sweeping flour dust from the mill's plank floor, stopped and watched, broom idle in his hands. It was the postmaster's wife who finally said it, plainly, without the old lace of her voice. They needed flour. They had no coin to spare until spring, and no goods worth trading. She did not ask for charity, she asked for credit, the way a farmer asks a neighbor for seed corn, knowing the asking costs something and the debt costs more. She remembered, standing there, the particular ache of an empty larder with 2 boys asleep in the next room, the arithmetic of stretching what little there was until it stopped being enough. She remembered the trading post scale, the crowd's laughter, the burnt loaves nobody would touch. She let the memory sit a moment, not to punish herself with it, but to be certain of what she was choosing. She told the boy to fetch the ledger. The rancher, who had come in behind them stamping snow from his boots, said nothing. He only watched her weigh the flour, sack after sack, and mark the names in the boy's careful hand, the postmaster's wife's name among them, entered without flourish, as though it belonged there. She did not write the name quickly. That was the thing the boy would remember years later, when he told it himself to his own children, that his mother's hand paused above the ledger's ruled line, pen wet, before it moved. In that pause was everything. She looked at the postmaster's wife's face and made herself see it plainly, the way she had once made herself taste her own bread plainly, without flinching from what it was. The woman's mouth, thinner now than it had been in September, had lost the sharpness that once curled it. Her coat was buttoned to the throat against a cold that had gotten into the house, not just the road. Her eyes did not meet Ruth's directly. That, too, she recognized. Shame kept its own posture. She had worn it herself, standing behind a barrel of flour with her son's hunger folded into her apron pocket like a coin she could not spend. She thought of the crowd that day in September, the laughter passing hand to hand like a jug nobody wanted to be caught not drinking from. She thought of the particular hollow under the ribs that came on the 4th day of thin rations, how it did not ache so much as hum, low and constant, until a person's thoughts bent around it the way a stream bends around a stone. She had fed that hunger to her sons in secret, eaten less herself, called it not being hungry when it was something else entirely. She did not think the postmaster's wife had ever gone that hungry, but she saw, now, that hunger did not require a ledger of comparison to be real. It only required the emptiness, and the fear of what came after the emptiness, and no clear way to fill either. She weighed out the sack. She did not make the woman ask twice, did not let the silence stretch long enough to become its own small cruelty. When she wrote the name, she wrote it the way she had written the others, no larger, no smaller, no mark beside it to say, "Remember what she did to you." The debt would stand on its own. That was enough. The rancher, still by the door, did not move to help her decide, though she felt his stillness the way a person feels weather before it arrives. He was watching, not the woman, but her, the set of her jaw, the steadiness of her hand, as if confirming something he had already believed a long while, and was in no hurry to say aloud. The debt did not vanish with the thaw. It came back slowly, the way frost leaves ground, from the edges first, then all at once when no one was watching closely enough to mark the day. The postmaster's wife sent her eldest boy to split wood for the mill's stove through February, and though the boy said little, he split more than was asked, stacking it higher than the eave, as if the extra cords were an apology his mother could not voice herself. Another woman brought a bolt of wool cloth she had woven herself, laid it on the counter without a word, and left before Ruth could thank her. A third paid in eggs, in butter, in the mending of a torn sack, in an afternoon spent scrubbing the millstone's grooves clean of last season's chaff. None of it came as coin. All of it came as labor, the only currency the valley had ever truly trusted, the same currency Ruth herself had spent her whole life paying in and being paid in return. She kept the ledger the way she had always kept it, plain, unadorned, each entry a fact and not a judgment. Her son's hand grew steadier at the columns as the weeks passed, his numbers straighter, and she noticed he no longer glanced up at her for approval before writing them down. He had learned the shape of trust the way she had learned bread, through repetition, not instruction. By the time the frost gave way to mud, and the mud gave way to the first green haze on the hills, the rancher no longer stood at the edges of the trading post, as a stranger, with a false name whispered behind hands. The postmaster said it plain now, to whoever asked, and whoever didn't, that the man who had bought half the valley under another man's paper was the same man who stood at the mill each morning beside the widow, sleeves rolled, forearms scarred, hauling sacks alongside tenants he had once saved from foreclosure without asking their thanks. No one called it charity anymore. They called it a partnership, said the word carefully at first, the way one tests ice before trusting it with full weight, and then said it plainly, the way a fact is said once it has been proven enough times to stop needing proof. He still spoke little. He did not need to. The mill's grinding stone, turning steady through the lengthening days, said enough for both of them. By the autumn of 1883, 6 years gone from the morning the crowd had laughed, the mill stood the way a good barn stands, not admired, simply trusted, the plank walls silvered by weather, and the millstone worn smooth in its center groove, from 300,000 turns. The road past the trading post had widened from wagon ruts to a graded track, because wagons came now from 2 counties over for the flour with the scorched taste, the one that kept through long freight hauls the way no pale Kansas flour could. People still called it smoked wheat. Nobody called it burnt anymore. The elder boy, 9 no longer but 15, and lean in the wrists, kept the ledger in a hand that had grown neat where it had once been careful. He knew every tenant's account, every sack owed and paid, and he argued a fair price with buyers twice his age, without raising his voice, because he had learned that from watching 2 people who never had to raise theirs to be believed. The younger boy, near 12 now, spent his days on the rancher's range instead of behind the counter, learning the weight of a rope and the patience of cattle, coming home smelling of horse and sage instead of flour, and no one thought it strange that a widow's sons had grown into a miller and a stockman under one roof neither of their fathers had lived to see built. She still fed the starter jar every morning before first light, the same cracked lid, the same clay gone dark with 60 years of use before it ever reached her hands, because some habits were not chores but a kind of prayer, and she did not intend to stop praying just because the hunger that had once made the ritual necessary was gone. Sometimes, kneading in the gray hour before the mill woke, she thought of the barrel her boy had once hidden behind, and the crowd's laughter, and the scale weighed short, and she understood now what she had not understood then, that the crust everyone had mocked was never a flaw to be corrected. It was the very thing that had carried a whole valley through a hard winter, hers and theirs both, the same rough shell that had kept a starving boy alive on a trail 40 years gone. She did not say this to anyone. She simply baked it the same way, scorched and misshapen and true, and let the eating be the only sermon anyone needed.